It's with a certain trepidation or fear that I even raised the topic of Buddhism and quantum physics. There's a large literature on this topic. Largely can be traced to two, or at least two books really made it big. Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics and Gary Zukav's The Dancing Woolly Masters. But there were many more. Amrit Goswami's The Self-Aware Universe, How Consciousness Creates the Material World, and Physics of Consciousness, The Quantum Mind and the Meaning of Life by Evan Harris Walker, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason that I think people get nervous even raising the topic is not actually because these books are bad on the physics. That's what I found interesting. It's that they're bad on the Asian philosophy. At the time, many of the authors of these books, they were serious physicists with PhDs, with research and publication, and so on. But the problem is many of them were the products of the counterculture and the New Age movement, so they're getting their mystical East notions from people like D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts and Krishnamurti, and accordingly they regarded Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Zen as simply different expressions of a common and somewhat superficial Vedantic monism. So while their grasp of Asian thought may have been limited, they were actually correct about the challenges to scientific naturalism posed by quantum physics. And in this regard, they were actually following in the footsteps of the pioneers of quantum science, including Einstein, Max Born, Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, de Broglie, Pauli, Werner Heisenberg, and so on and on. Okay, so so all these guys are really captured by the weirdness of quantum mechanics, and I'm not going to go into it here. I'll just mention the weirdness is generally grouped under four headings. There's wave-particle duality, often called complementarity. There's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and that's the notion that two conjugate variables of a single particle cannot be known at the same time. There's quantum entanglement and non-locality. You have two entangled particles distant in space that seem to communicate with one another instantaneously. And then there's the measurement problem, which is actually a problem that I'm working on as part of a larger project, and how it relates to the notion of Buddhist vikalpa. So these four puzzles all have one thing in common. Each foregrounds the relationship between the world that we observe and the mind that is doing the observing. It's the relationship between the mind-independent universe and our knowledge of that universe. So I've been working on the structural relationship between the quantum measurement problem and the Buddhist problem of vikalpa, or conceptual construction, as in both cases there's a sense in which the world that we engage is brought into being by that very engagement. And today, for the purpose of this conference on animals, I'm focusing on two unfortunate cats, both executed to make a philosophical point. And I'm going to start with Schrödinger's, and this is going to require very brief background into quantum mechanics. So according to what is now known as the Copenhagen interpretation, our measurement or observation or engagement with a quantum particle does not merely alter the nature of the particle, but it actually brings it into being. Prior to observation, there is no particle per se, but only a wave function that can be thought of as a superposition of multiple states called eigenstates. Now, various mathematical models, such as the Schrödinger equation or Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, describe with amazing precision the linear evolution of the wave function. That's the wave function through time. But these formal models can only predict the probabilities of what will appear when we actually interact with the wave. There is then an element of chance or randomness in what appears when we take a measurement. So scientists were then brought to talk about the act of measurement or observation as bringing about the collapse of the wave function, resulting in the appearance of one eigenstate out of many that comprise the superposition. Now, Bohr and Heisenberg are the two figures most closely associated with this Copenhagen position. In their view, the wave function does not represent an actual state of affairs in the mind-independent universe, but is rather a mathematical formula for predicting what we see when we go looking. Accordingly, the Copenhagen interpretation and other related anti-realist theories hold that it is impossible to understand the natural world without taking into consideration the act of measurement or observation or perhaps even consciousness. Right? This is weird stuff. They're the Madhyamikans in this argument. But not all scientists agreed. Einstein and Schrödinger were among the most famous opponents of the Copenhagen view. They felt that science necessitates belief in a determinative, objective reality that is prior to and distinct from mind. They argued that if quantum science doesn't give us purchase on this objective world, if it bottoms out in chance, then it must be incomplete. There's something we simply don't know. There must be some hidden variables that determine what appears. So the disagreement concerns the existence of some objective reality. Bohr and Heisenberg believe that it makes no sense to talk about the existence of a moon when no one is looking at it, that there is no determinative reality, no noumenal world lying beyond what appears. Einstein and Schrödinger thought this position was simply bizarre. It's absurd. Now, in May 1935, Einstein and two young assistants published a paper that they thought would be the decisive blow to the anti-realist paper, or the anti-realist position. I'm not going to go into it. It's one of the most famous papers in all of physics. It's called the EPR paper, and it argued that there would be you could entangle two particles such that if you did something to one particle, it would instantly affect the other. They showed, to them that was just bizarre because it would entail superluminal communication. So they said there must be something fundamentally wrong with quantum mechanics. So on reading this EPR paper, Schrödinger wrote to Einstein, concurring with his analysis, and the correspondence that ensued led directly to Schrödinger's cat. The impetus actually came from Einstein, but I'm not going to go into that. So in a subsequent letter to Schrödinger, Einstein came up with this kind of interesting idea. He imagines a keg of gunpowder that might explode sometime over the course of a year. It is patently absurd, he declares, to imagine the keg of gunpowder in a superposition both exploded and unexploded at the same time. It was apparently this letter that prompted Schrödinger to concoct his famous cat scenario. And this cat scenario first appears in an article published a few months after the EPR paper in 1935. And I'm quoting from it. He says, "One can even set up a ridiculous case. A cat is penned up in a steel chamber along with the following device, which must be secured against direct interference by the cat. In a Geiger counter, there is a tiny bit of radioactive substance so small that perhaps in the course of the hour, one of the atom decays, but also, with equal probability, perhaps it doesn't decay. If it happens, the counter tube discharges and through a relay releases a hammer that shatters a small flask of hydrocyanic acid. If one has left the entire system to itself for an hour, one could say that the cat still lives if meanwhile no atom has decayed. The first atomic decay would have poisoned it. So the psi function, that's the wave function, of the entire system would express this by having the living and the dead cat mixed or smeared in equal parts. So this is a fancy way of saying that the cat must be both alive and dead if you buy the Copenhagen interpretation that the particle has both decayed and not decayed. Now this cat-in-a-box experiment is an elegant reworking of Einstein's the previous experiments that the thought experiments he came up with, because it now explicitly ties an indeterminate event at the quantum level, the decay of a radioactive particle, to an event at the macro level, the death of a cat. To accept the notion of superposition, which is a blurring of two contradictory states at the quantum level, now demands that you accept it at the macro level. The cat must be alive and dead at the same time. Now note that this is a reductio ad absurdum argument. Schrödinger is not suggesting that this is true. On the contrary, he regards the notion that the cat could be alive and dead as so patently ridiculous that it will force folks like Bohr and Heisenberg to abandon their anti-realist stance. Moreover, putting a sentient creature inside the box rather than an insentient ball, Einstein's first thought was there was a ball in the box, it forces one to consider the cat's perspective on the matter. Surely the cat knows if it's alive or not. And this, I believe, is in part why he selected a cat, since we're more likely to empathize with a cute kitty than with many other creatures, and certainly not a ball. So somehow the deliberate murder of an innocent cat in this outlandish scenario underscores the outlandishness of the beliefs Schrödinger is ridiculing. Now, I'm going to skip a bunch here. Everything changed in 1964. There was this guy, John Bell, came out with an amazing paper, it's really quite brilliant, where he showed that it was possible experimentally to possibly disprove the hidden variable notion. It's what's called a no-go theorem. In other words, it can't tell you what's happening, but it can tell you what is not happening. And it turned out that what is not happening is that there are some hidden variables that determine the behavior of, predetermine the behavior of entangled particles. And with that, that ended up being tested. It was first tested in Berkeley in the early 70s. It's been tested multiple times since then in an attempt to remove any loopholes, and it turns out that local realism is not true, right? The Copenhagen people look like they have won. Now, the summary should be sufficient to see why at least some physicists, compelled by evidence on the anti-realist side, held that a scientific account of quantum phenomena was impossible without reference to consciousness in mind. Some of them dabbled in Asian philosophy for precisely this reason. They believed that Asian monistic philosophies of ancient heritage had some kind of handle on consciousness and its relationship with the manifest world. In short, contemplating the mysteries of quantum mechanics had a way of turning hard-headed scientists into Eastern mystics. In time, the plight of Schrödinger's cat, which was originally intended as an amusing caricature and repudiation of a harebrained interpretation of quantum mechanics, came to stand for the very opposite. That Schrödinger's cat is in some mysterious fashion both alive and dead came to embody the believe it or not strangeness of the quantum world. I use an example of that. When Bohr was awarded the Order of the Elephant, and he had to come up with a, what's it called, a seal, this is what he came up with. Right? The Latin inscription says, opposites are complementary. Now to turn to Song Dynasty Chan and the plight of a similarly innocent creature, Nan Chuan's cat. This story is best known from case 14 of the Womanguan, and I'm just going to read it. Master Nan Chuan came upon the monks of the eastern and western quarters arguing over a cat. Thereupon Nan Chuan held up the cat and said, if one among you can speak the truth, you will save the cat. If not, I'll slice it in two. No one said anything, so Nan Chuan sliced the cat in two. That evening, Zhao Zhou returned, and Nan Chuan raised the incident with him. Thereupon, Zhao Zhou took off his sandals, placed them on top of his head, and walked out. The master said, had you been there, you would have saved the cat. And woman comments, now tell me, what is the meaning of Zhao Zhou putting his sandals on his head? If you can give me a single transformative word in response to this, then you will see that Nan Chuan's injunction was not a pointless exercise, if not misfortune. Now, in order to unpack this anecdote, a bit of background is in order. Larger monasteries in China, at least by the Song period, where the case genre first came into being, were divided into a Western half for religious practice and an Eastern administrative half. The anecdote doesn't mention what the quarrel was about, but presumably cats were valued in monasteries as they kept rodents at bay. However, the fact that the cat uses a binome with a diminutive suffix for cat, a maor, perhaps better translated as kitty, suggests that the rival group simply fancied the cat because it was cute. That we're not told what the quarrel is about has a certain conceptual elegance. We know only that there are two sides, each with its own conflicting interests, views, and perspectives. In other words, the content of the dispute is beside the point. The quarrel over the cat offers the master a teachable moment, an opportunity to demand that his students rise above their contingent, conventional, bifurcated frames of reference and respond from the perspective of the absolute. He demands that they speak their attainment, which is an overdetermined compound that means both to attain the way and to express what is thereby attained. But this is the vikalpa problem. The conditioned and contingent world that is known to us through the senses is the product of the distinctions imposed by our cognitive apparatus. Buddhist practice is directed toward the attainment of the ultimate, a non-conceptual or unconditioned state or understanding, And by definition, this state must transcend or be free of all distinctions, and hence cannot be captured or transmitted through words. Nor can it be signified through silence, as silence is meaningful only to the extent that it has something to say. In other words, it must entail viculpa. To even posit such a state, to imagine a goal toward which one can aspire, is already to be thrown into dualism and error. So what is one to do? So Nan Chuan's demand for a true word is a trap. Any attempt to respond, including responding through some kind of silence, is destined to fail. The two quarreling sides each want a whole cat, a real, intact, living cat, but they shirk from the challenge thrown at them, which is to express their wholeness. And so they end up with a sliced cat, a parsed or disaggregated product of the conceptually constructed world in which we find ourselves. So why does Jiaozhou succeed where the others fail? He knows that there's no place to stand, there's no true word to be given, but he also knows that a bodhisattva is compelled to transmit the Dharma and thus has no choice but to respond. So he upends things, figuratively and literally, placing his sandals on top of his head. Now, most of the traditional commentators say that this action is meaningless, it's kind of a non sequitur, and that's its meaning. But I think that that's not what's going on. I think Jiaozhou's action is, that's only half the truth. His gesture is more than a mere refusal to be drawn into Nan Chuan's trap. There's a certain dramatic and conceptual eloquence to his mute response. Placing his soiled footwear on his head is a profane and vaguely offensive act that suggests disapproval, if not censure. At the same time, it represents a reversal or upending or turning the tables. In this way, Jiaozhou not only escapes Nan Chuan's trap, but he also manages to one-up his teacher in a gesture that suggests playful ridicule. Nan Chuan, delighted by Jiaozhou's audacity, acknowledges that Jiaozhou would have saved the cat. So Nan Chuan is sitting at the opposite end of the realist-anti-realist divide from Schrödinger, whereas Schrödinger is arguing that there must be some independent mind-independent truth of the matter. Nan Chuan's challenge is predicated on precisely the opposite, the anti-realist insight that there is no outside, no escape from the contingency of the subject position. They both use a cat or a kitty to dramatically drive home their point. And in both cases, as a public relations ploy, the gambit works. In the popular imagination, Schrödinger and Nan Chuan are known for one thing, and one thing only, their murder of a cat. Thank you.